Stray had the design goal to develop a realistic cat as a protagonist, first and foremost, with many elements of gameplay and story deriving directly from that premise. Deciding what the player character will be in any video game is arguably the most fundamental decision in the development process. Stray was successful in many ways, particularly how graceful the cat looks and feels during the game. However, other elements in the game were not as well realized and deserve criticism. If you have not played Stray yet, I recommend that you do before watching this, as there will be several spoilers. Having an animal as a protagonist in a video game is nothing new, of course, and there have been many different approaches to the idea. More often than not, it is an anthropomorphized, cartoonish representation of an animal, but sometimes developers go for something more realistic or stylized in a different manner. More important, however, are the gameplay ramifications of centering a game around an animal. For example, games like Snake Pass use specific animals and their physical features to provide unique challenges or to allow players to perform actions that would be impossible for humans. On the other hand, you can take advantage of certain cultural expectations regarding the animals as the motivation for your setting and experience. Man-Eater relies on the image sharks have as ferocious predators, mostly from the popularity of Jaws and other movies. Something similar happens to Goat Simulator, and the player can control Pilgor to run, bash, leak, and wreak general havoc, like we all know every goat does on a regular basis. However, these two games are also capitalizing on the absurdity of their premises for a comedic effect. Stray is more serious than that, so many of the activities we associate with house cats are presented as endearing or useful. There are a few moments when you have to cause a moderate amount of chaos to progress, but the very scripted nature of these events robs them of their potential spontaneity. The best example is making the robot kids drop the paint bucket. In my first playthrough, I did that before I even knew it would be necessary to progress the story, and it made for a memorable moment. Stray misses the mark by not generating more of these situations outside story progression. You can make a couple of companions trip and fall, but their reaction is just to get up and keep walking, even the one who is acting as a policeman. The dedicated meow button and the ability to just sleep in some places are simple but effective ways to build up the catness in a more organic way, but not enough to shake off some of the deterministic way the game plays out, as they do not affect the world meaningfully. It may be unfair to ask a small team like BlueTwelve to craft more optional activities, particularly when they at least manage to cram some non-linearity into a few levels, but I think it is justified given how unfocused the game ends up being. As it is, Stray has escape sequences, platforming and exploration sections, a couple of stealth zones, and a few puzzles and fetch quests here and there, which is impressive in terms of breadth, but not so much for depth. Gameplay is varied, but never very engaging on a mechanical level. When comparing it to another animal game that focused more on its strengths, this becomes clear. Untitled Goose Game is just a series of stealth puzzles, but it got the fundamentals right. Geese are gangly creatures, and despite the stylized visuals, the available actions capture that. Despite there being optimal solutions for the goose jobs you need to perform, the game lets the player experiment and be playful with the mechanics beyond the objectives laid out at each level. This would probably not be possible to achieve if the game included a chasing sequence. Even with infinite development time, it would be a poor choice to deviate too much from what this game was trying to achieve. You can see in Stray how that could work if exploration and platforming were more of a focus. The strongest section of the game, the slums, is an interesting area with alternative routes, shortcuts, and the more engaging platforming sections. We are far from Mario or even Spyro here, as the game system for jumping around is restricted to pre-selected climbing points in the style of an Uncharted sequence. However, it is more involved, particularly as you need to find paths for some locations. Also, the lack of mechanical challenge in platforming or even the complete absence of a jump option beyond the predefined objects can be excused as a way to mimic how cats are outstandingly good at gauging heights and landing, but it inevitably forces the game to find some other ways through which players can exercise their catness. I already mentioned the small touches, like the meow button, but the strongest asset Stray has in its favor is the environment. The decayed city and its 3 layers of settlements are familiar enough for us to understand what each building and each robot companion are supposed to be, while at the same time being strange enough to entice curiosity. There is no reason to think a cat from centuries into the future, way after humans were extinct, would have the same standardized knowledge about cities that we have, let alone exhibit domesticated traits that would be long gone from cats by then. But this is not a big issue. The important thing is the cat is stray, in the same sense the player is, at least a little bit, out of their element, having to learn some things from scratch, but not entirely helpless. In its best moments, Stray manages to capture that feeling of being lost or confused about an area until you gain enough familiarity with it, but at the same time the game ends up letting go of those moments too easily. The robot settlements are the best for that, as they are large enough to enhance exploration and platforming, although the slums are the only one where verticality and wideness are truly present. Midtown lacks in above ground options, while Ant Village is almost all verticality. The chapters that connect these areas are linear quests of moving from point A to point B, with one of the other gameplay elements picking up the pace. Stealth in the factory and the jail, escape sequences in the beginning and the sewers, small puzzles here and there. With these settings, it is hard to really get stray for a moment, but even the settlements get too familiar too fast. The main culprit is the story and the narrative options that went into it. While the world crafted in Stray is interesting in its own right, the choice for introducing the drone character not only to give gameplay options but to also dump exposition and talk directly to the robots is very disappointing. Learning some lore is not required to appropriately explore the city, and not getting it firsthand would enhance the sense of discovery. Instead, the cat gets clear, unequivocal interpretations and directions from the robots about who they are, what they expect the cat to do, where to go, etc. The opportunity to have difficulties in communication as part of the strayness experience was sadly missed. For all its many other flaws, Spirit of the North gets this better by adopting a journey-esque approach that keeps the sense of wonder and intrigue for the most part. In comparison, Stray is too cluttered with text and conversations, when it could have been more consistently creative in its ways to interact with the robots. It is true that Stray basically does everything else better, particularly the way controlling the cat is always comfortable, never as finicky and outright unpleasant like the fox in Spirit of the North. It shows how the presentation and mechanical qualities of Stray should not be forgotten, despite significant room for improvement. In any case, this dependence on making the story too explicit and laid out in Stray might have been baked in since early in development, together with figuring out the cat's animations, which are very well realized by the way. It may even be the case that a more minimalist approach to the narrative was attempted, but did not work for some reason. This is speculation of course, but even if there was a good motivation, it is not less disappointing. You may think players have to get a clear story-related motivation to keep going, but that was already present from the start, finding a way out of the city and back to the little tabby's posse. In my view, Stray could have been only about getting back home, as I was missing the other 3 pals from the beginning until the time I finished the game. Overall, Stray gets many design challenges right, particularly with presentation. It is not the runt of the litter, but it failed to climb as high as it could. The visuals are of a rare breed, while the unnecessary exposition and the unskippable cutscenes drag it down. It is often adorable, but not stray enough. I wish I could say it was perfect, but I can only give it a meow out of 10.